Good morning, good afternoon to those who are watching in Kiev. My name is Melinda Haring. I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We're very pleased to have three terrific experts with us today to examine Zelensky's first year in office. Earlier this week, we took a look at his foreign policy. Today, we're going to take a look at his domestic policy. I'm joined by former Minister Dr. Tymofiy Mylovanov, who's now the president of Kiev School of Economics, and also on faculty at University of Pittsburgh. Thank you, Tymofiy, for being here with us. I'm also joined by Adrian Karatnycky, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and one of the best experts on Ukraine here in America. I'm also joined by Dr. Anders Åslund, my colleague at the Atlantic Council and a familiar face on these webinars. Now, before we jump into our discussion, I'd like to invite you to participate. You can participate on Twitter or on Facebook. Please write questions. You can send these throughout our discussion if something comes up. So please use the chat function down below on Zoom or submit a question using the hashtag #FutureUkraine on Twitter. Now, I'd like to ask my first question to Adrian. Adrian, I've noticed that you have been kind of hesitant to proclaim judgment about Volodymyr Zelensky. What do you make of his record after his first year in office?
The reason it's hard to make a judgment on Zelensky is because there is no sense of where Zelensky stands on issues. I think he is, he has come into governance without a set of guiding principles. He has not grown as a politician or as a state leader. He has not surrounded himself with the best and brightest. In fact, he kicked out many of the best and brightest when he reshuffled his government several months ago. So it's really hard to make an assessment of someone because I don't think he has a firm idea of what he is doing. He has no underlying governing philosophy. And so there are moments where there are people who come into his sphere of the contact and interaction. They are not there permanently. The only people who are there permanently is the same small crew of entertainment lawyers and entertainment specialists and technology specialists who serviced his comedy empire. And that's no way to govern. But on the other hand, it makes it very hard to really assess what he is all about.
Okay, great. Thank you for that opening statement. Dr. Anders Åslund, is Adrian being excessively harsh when saying that Zelensky has no governing strategy? What do you think of that claim?
Right. What is a serious concern is that there is no government program. We thought that there was sort of a government program until he changed the government on the 4th of March. And worse, when he sacked the prosecutor general on the 5th of March. And then on the 24th of April, the excellent heads of customs and tax services were sacked. So the last three were then three big fighters against corruption that he sacked. And what he said in his speech in the parliament on the 4th of March was essentially the only good thing about this government was that they were honest, as if honesty was no longer important. And if you don't have a program and you don't have a direction in Ukraine, you get caught in the old ways. And this is aggravated by the system of governance. Ukraine has never been as centralized as it is now, not even under Yanukovych. Everything goes from the president's office down, and the president essentially has three close advisors and nobody else. The others in the presidential office don't seem to matter. And these people are not very knowledgeable about anything about economics. And the cabinet of the ministers that have essentially always functioned in Ukraine has now pretty much ceased to function. So the ministers are receiving their orders directly from the president. Tymofiy can probably tell us much more about how this internal governance is functioning. So what one previously used to have a meeting between the relevant ministers and the prime minister those meetings don't really seem to take place. Instead, it is the president, a few advisors, and the relevant minister who meet. And this is no way of coordinating a policy. So first, there is no direction. And secondly, there is no clear coordination of the policies. And then it's all too easy that the old forces take over. And this is aggravated by President Zelenskyy and his advisors being extremely sensitive to what media say. And several of the media are controlled by oligarchs, and several of them by pro-Russian forces. And this causes a very unhealthy bias. Therefore, it's important that the West is engaged. And during the quarantine now, the West is not engaged. The West needs to engage more. So I think that this IMF agreement is a good step in the right direction. And I hope that Mikhail Saakashvili's appointment as head of the President's Reform Committee will mean that there is a clear reform voice. President Saakashvili knows what needs to be done. His focus is rule of law and deregulation. Unfortunately, it has a lot of other things also.
Thank you so much, Anders. I have about 8 follow-up questions from that opening statement, but I want to bring Tymofiy in. Tymofiy, you were the former Minister of Economic Development, Trade, and Agriculture until May 4th. Can you step back and tell us what was the government's biggest achievement in the last year, and what was its worst misstep?
Well, it's the same thing. I think the land market reform, it was supposed to be transformational. We have been in Ukraine having a moratorium on this market for 20 years. In fact, the market exists. It's just shadow. It's corrupt officials, using the state land for personal enrichment. It's a surrogate approach towards trading rights, not property rights over the land, but rather leasing rights. As a result, the land cannot be used as a collateral. As a result, the people who actually operate on this land for decades by now, they have no property rights over this land, and so they're always subject to hold up either by the government officials or by competitors. So the idea was to start this market, to actually make it bring it out of the shadow, and in that way to bring something in the Ukrainian economy which can be used as a collateral, because the agricultural trade, the sector, the industry is growing, and it's a very successful area of the economy. And that would be a startup for proper banking, credit services for the capital markets. And also it would be transformational in terms of market economy, because in Ukraine, Ukrainian citizens and even businesses really don't own much. We don't have much property. Apart from apartments, people do not really hold stock because we don't have stock markets. All the property rights over companies are subject to potential extortions because the legal system and the court system is very weak. So there's no sense. Ukrainians have not really experienced, with the exception of apartments, the notion of property, the notion of investment in your property, in using your property to leverage your business ideas and build up successful businesses. So the idea of creating the agricultural market for land was to transform Ukraine and finally bring it to the market economy. And that has been done. The previous administrations, the previous governments tried. It was there were attempts under Poroshenko, under Yanukovych, under Yushchenko even, and it was not successful. Yet the way the market is introduced is really, a joke, frankly. There's a limit of 1 square kilometer per person in terms of how much you can purchase. Legal entities, companies are not allowed to buy land. And therefore, it's not really a market. It's just a a PR stunt that we have introduced the land market. Yet it was a big deal in the parliament. The parliament had to consider 4,000 amendments to get through. Even this cut down version of the market was impossible to pass. So, it's a victory and at the same time a total tragedy, because this would have been a source of economic growth for Ukraine. This would be something which would push the economy forward and would give some hope to people. But why that happened? Because what perhaps my colleagues have just mentioned. Guiding principles is one, and very, very steep response to public opinion. And if public opinion can be manipulated by vested interests through media and protests in front of the parliament, then you can capture the reform. And so, the political space for the reform has been decreased over the last half a year dramatically. And in the end, yes, we passed some land market reform. It's transformational, but not really.
Tymofiy, why has that space decreased over the last 6 months? We saw the turbo regime in September, October. A lot of businessmen I talked to were really excited about all of the energy in the Rada. But like you said, we've seen 2 big bills passed. We saw the land market reform bill pass and the banking bill passed this week. They were both clogged with enormous numbers of amendments. Is it that servant of the people in the Rada is fragmenting, or what's going on?
It is ironic in some sense. This is the parliament which has been able to pass very difficult laws very quickly, and at the same time has been unbelievably slow on a couple of laws, which perhaps are even less controversial than the original laws which were passed early in September. So I haven't seen, or I don't remember a parliament which has been so, swinging from one extreme to another. I just want to remind all of us and the audience that Poroshenko tried to pass the law on anti-corruption court and has been unable to do that. And it was a major stumbling block for the IMF program, for other programs, and all the IFI conditions, but also inside of Ukraine, there was a lot of pressure to do that. The same was the issue with the law on illegal enrichment and a number of other laws. And they were passed in a moment, as if nothing were there to pass in September and October and November maybe. And then by the end of December, everything stalled. So partly this is the issue of the majority in the servant of people collapsing. It was obvious that we do not have 226 or 250 votes anymore, because it's the banking law which you mentioned just now, and it was passed this week. The president was in the parliament, and yet the servant of the people only gave 200 votes. Not the entire faction voted, despite the presence of the president, but the presence of the president is the ultimate signal for the party to vote. Yeah. So there is lack of discipline. We can discuss details of where it's coming from. Essentially, MPs are becoming captured by vested interest, including being paid. At least that's the rumor on the blog. I haven't seen it myself, but it's common knowledge, or consensus now, that some MPs are taking money. But I think there is another fundamental reason behind that, why it's always like that in Ukraine, why the political space very quickly evaporates. The reason is there is no clean financing model for the political competition. Politics is costly, even in Ukraine. People have to be paid, even just simply salaries. If the salary of the member of parliament is 30,000 hryvnias, which is 1,000 euros, it's very difficult to expect these guys to be not for sale several months into the season. So, and there's no way how you can finance them cleanly. Either these guys have to take money from the oligarchs and vested interests, or you have to allow them to get some political appointments, and in that way you basically breed corruption. So in fact, if you as political leader want to be more independent from oligarchs, you are forced to tolerate some corruption inside the system. because you want the source of money to be controlled by you, not by oligarchs. So it's a constant battle. This is a lose-lose situation for Ukraine. And I think until we clean up that issue, the financing of politicians, we won't be able to get rid of this pattern where new group of people comes in, very romantic atmosphere, everything is moving in the right direction, and then 3-5 months into the game, business as usual.
Tymofiy, I think that the issue is partly what you addressed, but the other issue is the failure of kind of a shaping of politics around values and ideology. In every country, there are lobbies and interest groups, and in every country, senators, congressmen, members of parliament make some accommodations for those interests and can sometimes be influenced by those groups, their lobbying potential and so on. But they often are guided by a certain central set of beliefs. The most remarkable thing about the Servant of the People was that it came with none of those. In the last days of this presidential campaign, Zelenskyy went on the air with a group of dewy-eyed reformers and was in a sense signaling that this was the path on which he was going to embark. But in truth, he did not embark on that path, or if he did, it lasted only a few months. And then, the first signal that happened was when the party, which claimed it was a libertarian party, the Servant of the People, said that its ideology would then be social democratic, or a merger of libertarianism and social democracy, with all of those contradictions. It sort of meant that there is a leadership vacuum in the ruling party, or in the now minority ruling party, because there is no set of binding ideas. It's true, as Anders has suggested, that the energy and world vision of Mikhail Saakashvili may give a little bit more life to the libertarian impulse and the market impulse. But Mr. Saakashvili is a very unpredictable political player. He has authoritarian tendencies, and he has personal ambitions, which are very soon, I believe, going to come into conflict with the president's own desire to be prima inter pares in all matters and to control matters. Apropos of presidential control, the deputy, the number 2 in this new office of reform, this new executive of this Economic Reform Council, is Mr. Olshansky, who is a very close intimate who works on a day-to-day basis, has worked out of Mr. Yermak's office. So I think that we're seeing the continuation of this kind of a centralized model, but unfortunately not guided by a set of governing principles. We're back to where we were before, where basically the only liberal voice in Ukraine is the IMF and the international community. And none of the reformers who were initially integrated, their values didn't seep through. There is a minority inside the Servant of the People that I would say is liberal, has a patriotic vision of the country, but the rest is a group of people of very unknown credentials who are at the moment swayed by presidential pressure. The most optimistic thing in this configuration is that there is a group that is kind of mimicking the Euro-optimists inside which existed in the previous government, mimicking that formation. It's not quite formal, but a group of 30 or so that have both liberal and patriotic values that have emerged as a fairly cohesive both voting bloc and a bloc of values. And I take that to be a positive trend, but I am very depressed by the idea that there is no growth in nation building, state building, or even a governing set of beliefs that would, people talk about red lines for Mr. Zelenskyy. A president shouldn't have red lines. He should have green lights for a path that he has developed for himself. And as Anders has mentioned, I think that's the biggest, I would say, failure, the biggest, and then what we are up against is inconsistency of policy, the potential for future reversals, and the kind of confusion that these reversals will mean for the confidence that Western institutions, investors may have in Ukraine.
Great. Thank you so much. Those are really insightful remarks. Anders, you wanted to jump in. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. I very much agree with essentially everything that Tymofiy and Adrian have said here, but let me add a few other aspects to it. Normally you have this, what Leszek Balcerowicz called extraordinary politics, that lasts maximum 1 year. normally half a year. What was peculiar about the Zelenskyy reform was, as Tymofiy said, it lasted only 3 months. So this is much shorter than these periods normally function. You can say during the Yatsenyuk premiership, there was a clear leadership, and there was essentially a year of a bit more than a year of substantial reforms. So why was it so short? And of course, this comes from what the Zelenskyy victory was. It was not only anti-politics, it was also anti-ideology, as Adrian eloquently elaborated upon. It was populism, it was egalitarianism, it was libertarianism, moving in a very different direction. And if you don't have any direction, why would you follow any direction? So it's really that this government needs to adopt a program. It hasn't. It's quite unique that the current cabinet of ministers was appointed without a program. Normally you have one, at least pro forma, but this did not. And you need reformers. Ukraine has today lots of quite experienced reformers, and none of them is in government because they are not desired. Instead, you have these old Soviet ideas. We need people who can work with a real economy, people who have experience. Well, experience in Ukraine, that is to be corrupt. And that's exactly what you don't want. What you need is people like Tymofiy, professionals with international experience who are coming back to Ukraine. These are the kind of people you would like to see. And the just fact heads of the customs and tax authorities are exactly that kind of people. And Ukraine has a lot of them. And what one would like to see is that President Zelenskyy looks around and see who are the most competent reformers who can really improve this society, and then we would get a different situation. I would also add to what Tymofiy said about the parliament. Face it, 30 of the MPs in the servant of the people are really servants of Kolomoisky. They are paid for by him. They are his former employees by and large, and they are his current employees, only that they sit in parliament instead. And they are quite skillful. They're probably among the most skillful parliamentarians because they are previous television personalities. So they know how to speak and how to manipulate. And this is the fundamental problem. What I would advise President Zelenskyy to do is to accept that he has a party of 200 people, set a program for them, and then line up with 2 out of 3 other parties that are reformists, Poroshenko's European Solidarity, Vyacheslav Vakarchuk's Golos Voice, and Andrei Veryevsky's party Trust. These are the 3 parties that are voting for the bank law and for the land reform law. And he should form this up so that it is a coalition. And if it's a coalition government, then it would be a political government rather than just a government of accidental technocrats or people who happen to know somebody close to the relevant power brokers. And of course, Tymofiy touched upon a very important point about financing. And here, President Zelenskyy himself is the main problem. He has said in at least 2 speeches that salaries of any state employee should be limited to 10 times the minimum salary. That is $1,800 per month. And then you don't get good people. This is a pro-corruption policy. I don't know if President Zelenskyy understands that or not. And in the parliament now, I hear indirectly that the parliamentarians say, now we have been elected, we have voted for all these anti-corruption laws, but where is the money? Aren't we supposed to be paid? And the old idea is that you get $10,000 in an envelope once a month if you are a parliamentarian. Obviously, other forces in parliament are maintaining the old standard. I don't know it for sure, but I presume that's the case. And then people in the ruling party say, why should we not be paid when everybody else is? And then, in all probability, money has popped up from various sources. That's the rumor I heard my journalist, or more than rumor, when I was in Kiev last 2 months ago. So you have to get control over the political financing, and you also have to get control over the pro-Russian media.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anders. Timofey, I have to ask you this question. You were part of the Honcharuk government that was sacked in March. President Zelenskyy came out and he said that his first government was not effective, but I've been told by several people that you have some back of the napkin calculations that show that the government you were part of was just as effective before. Can you tell us about your calculations and what you think really happened? Why did you guys all get sacked on the 4th?
Well, I could have stayed actually as the Minister of Agriculture to continue on with the land reform, but I decided to quit together with Honcharuk. Two names in the new cabinet were particularly troublesome for me and pushed me away. It was Yemets, the Minister of Health, and it was Umansky, the Minister of Finance, who quickly resigned or were forced to resign 3 weeks into new government. So even the cabinet couldn't stand them. I think Umansky promised that there is life without the IMF and couldn't deliver, and Yemets was just out there having really, frankly, no idea about the position he ended up in. This what was the last drop for me, why I thought I couldn't continue, because these two people forced me essentially with their presence. In terms of efficiency, I think Honcharuk, he is a young politician. He doesn't have much experience. He's a person to watch for the next 20, 30 years. That's obvious. But he did have a program. And in many ways, he's much more pro-market and pro-liberal than me. And I'm a trained Western economist who I have a career in the West, in the US, and most people consider to be me very liberal. And also Bogdan, the person who was the head of the office and resigned shortly before the Honcharuk's government was sacked. I think that person was even more pro-liberal and pro-market. He provided me with a lot of support and defense against all these old Soviet-style ideas about real economy, and keeping the status quo. So I think Honcharuk was sacked after Bogdan was sacked. So the real question is why Bogdan was sacked, because once Bogdan was out, Honcharuk didn't have backing to stay in place, and the prime minister's seat and the minister's positions are always a prize worth fighting for. And of course, you can go in details and saying that Kolomoisky was interested, and there were audio recordings, and Honcharuk was not organizationally competent enough, and he didn't have a political backing in the parliament. All those details, but I think are important but secondary. In terms of performance, Ukraine grew 3.2% in 2019. Of course, this is both the first half of the year and the second half of the year. The budget was fulfilled, Matt, and a number of structural reforms were introduced. Just in my ministry, I think sent 960 companies to privatization out of 3,000. And it is the largest ever in the history of Ukraine, including the 90s. It's the largest ever batch to be sent to privatization. 430 of them.
Hold on, Timofey. Were any of them actually privatized, or were they only sent to the board?
To the privatization agency. There is an agency which can sell and and it's actually in the constitution. So we have to go through that agency. Some of them have been privatized, but not the large ones.
Okay.
And on a lot of large ones, of course, there is a backlash. Anders mentioned the salaries issue. There's also pressure on the supervisory boards, on corporate governance reform, on all of this. And there are also questionable appointments, at least in the area of agricultural companies, which I really spent a lot of time getting the people out, the corrupt officials out. And now I think see some of them coming back. But also the land market, the initial land market was pro-growth, the structure of the land market. Then there was a labor market reform. So in some sense, it was a very classic structural approach. You need to create markets, you need to develop markets, so you need to liberalize, you need to deregulate, you need to privatize, you need to do capital market developments, you need to do labor market reform, you have to do land market and all that kind of thing. So there was nothing unusual. It was by the book. It is what worked in other countries, in neighbors, in Poland, in Slovakia, in Czech Republic. And of course, all of that while maintaining macroeconomic stability or macrofinancial stability, which I think due to the central bank and Markaro, the Minister of Finance, I think they have done a superb job, and the cost of borrowing and capital was dropping. And this is because of their work. Today, Ukraine is still riding on this wave of macroeconomic stability. So we had stability, we had a growth, and we had a number of structural reforms moving forward. So in that sense, from whatever angle you take, I think Honduras's government has done well.
Great, thank you. Adrian, I'd like to turn to you. And for those of you who are just joining us now, we are assessing Zelensky's first year in office and looking at his domestic reforms. We invite you to submit questions either on Twitter or on Zoom. Adrian, some reformers in Kiev are saying that there are some serious rollbacks on a number of reforms, including anti-corruption, health, civil service, and fiscal reform. What has been rolled back? What should we be concerned about next? And who's pushing these rollbacks?
Well, the first thing I would say, the rollback that I'm most concerned about, the two rollbacks are, I would say, a reversion to the mean in the justice justice system and in the criminal justice system, and a reversion to the mean in the sense of unpleasant and not friendly mean in terms of policies. A spate of attacks on journalists, investigations, criminal cases being launched, a number of criminal cases being launched as immediately on ministers upon their exiting from the government, which bespeaks a kind of a regression in terms of and concerns about the state of civil liberties. Attacks on Maidan activists, opening criminal cases that had been closed by the procuracy for lack of cause, and the prosecution of what I would say are frivolous or preposterous cases against former political leaders, including President Poroshenko. I'm not going to say blanketly that there are no issues that deserve not to be investigated in terms of Poroshenko in his past government, but the cases that were brought forward and which were resisted by the prosecutor general, who was fired allegedly because he resisted proceeding with these frivolous and weak cases, suggests that there is a certain kind of a climate of meanness and retribution that is also at the heart of the government. I wouldn't say that there is a sort of an entire rollback. I think the reason that there is not this massive rollback partly is because, I mean, I agree with Tymofiy that there was growth last year, but you have to admit that growth dropped steeply in the fourth quarter and in the first few months of even before the coronavirus crisis, and I think that led and the drop in popularity of the government in polling data for this poll-driven president motivated him to reshuffle. The problem was not just that the reshuffle was too broad, but that the reshuffle was done without, as we have repeatedly mentioned, and Adrian and you have said, without a governing philosophy, without a sense of what is the vision. It was done quickly. I think the decision was made to dismiss people in a haphazard system of selecting their successors was implemented, which has led to additional resignations of ministers, so creating a kind of an internal chaos. I think all of this has slowed, and I think that coronavirus, in a sense, has contributed both to the slowing of kind of the setting up of markers and red lines for the president, because there is no opportunity for external protest. But at the same time, it creates a dangerous situation of, I would say, pent-up public frustration and anger, which may reveal itself in a month or two down the line. So yes, there are concerns that I think fairly smart and well-received ideas of Ulana Suprun are being jettisoned, and nothing sensible is being done in their place, including hang-ups and delays in the payments of medical personnel at the height of a medical emergency. The biggest problem, though, it seems to me, is this justice system. But it again comes from a lack of a worldview. There are criminal cases being investigated today by people who were fighting the Ruskaya Vesna, the Russian Spring, in places like Odessa and elsewhere. Cases that were investigated and put to rest by the previous administration. And there is a kind of a moral equivalence that, well, of course, everyone is equal under the law, but the absence of understanding a context, that the country was under threat, that the country was under attack, and that citizens, in the absence of rapid government action, took matters into their own hands, was at least something that was implicitly understood by the previous government. And here is another problem. The two, I would say, I wouldn't call them epochal, but two fundamental movements that shaped the civic life in Ukraine over the last 6 years were the Maidan and the early volunteer efforts to build resistance to the Atoll and to resist the Russian Spring. None of the representatives of that ethos or those values are currently in the administration. They were substantially present in various forms, in various ministries before the purge, so to speak. And it seems to me that that's another problem, that this government is not only rudderless, but it is in a sense spiritless, because those movements gave a certain degree of momentum, focus, and I would say values to the political process. And they are completely absent, not only in the government, but in the head of state.
Adrian, the one slight correction, though, Dmitry Kuleba, the foreign minister, definitely comes from that camp. So there's at least one.
So does, I would say, and so does Mr. Avakov. I mean, I'm speaking broadly.
Broadly, no, that's a fair point. Let me ask you
one. Is hated by civic activists, but in terms of the fight against the Atoll, in terms of the fight against the Russian Spring, and in terms of his participation in the Maidan, he was certainly there. And I'm not saying that is determinative, that is transformative of people's habits of the heart and people's style of governance and authoritarian impulses and business impulses and the like. But it is important, but a foreign minister is not privy to the expression of those values in the, especially if the cabinet of ministers is not really the place where the key domestic decisions are being made.
Absolutely. Let me ask you one follow-up question, and give me a 2-sentence response if you can, please. Why are reformers? So we've all mentioned Max Neferev, the former head of customs and the brains behind Prozoro, Sergei Verlanov, who was the head of the tax authority, and he was recently sacked, and then Ruslan Rябошапka, who was a very good general prosecutor. All three of these guys have been sacked, and they're being hit with charges. But the interesting thing is that these charges are coming from different law enforcement bodies. What does this mean, and who stands to gain behind these charges?
Well, it's a terrible habit. I think that Tymofiy can speak to it more accurately than I can. I don't think this is an organized, systematic campaign, but the problem is that there is a sort of a confluence of these events, which after a while itself sends signals to the criminal justice system. How do prosecutors, investigators, police determine what is expected of them. How are they to comport themselves? If there is a signal that they are to behave, neutrally above the law, but then they will more likely be willing or able or inclined to do so. If the signal is to go after people who are no longer in favor, that sends a broader signal to the entire criminal justice system. And I think we have never encountered specific instructions where there is a sheet that goes to the prosecutor general's office that's distributed to all prosecutors and say, go after my political opponents, protect these and these people. What happens is a culture develops and signals are sent and an ethos develops. And the ethos is the most dangerous problem. But I'd leave it to Tymofiy to explain why reformers, as he has often said, are the one, if you're not doing a good job reforming, you won't have a criminal case against you.
I want to comment, I think there is a systemic effort, but not by the government, not the president. There's a systemic effort to make work in the government and the public service toxic. And these are all different elements of this. The pressure to lower salaries, to make it, absolutely uninteresting for professionals who are non-politicians, just professionals to work in the government. That's just one side of it. Another one is indeed criminal investigation. The criminal code in Ukraine allows for opening criminal investigations in a very easy manner. You actually have to open the case. It's called in Ukrainian провадження, if you get a complaint. That's different from bringing it to prosecute you in the court, but often it's just complaints. And then you get in the register, and then the detectives start interrogating you, and so on and so forth. This is done often through media. This is done through Telegram channels even. Yeah. I've received pressure where people would dig out some old even online lectures of me, get the quotes out of the context, put pressure, put it on TV, and it would have been done through Telegram channels or social media channels of people who flee to Russia, previous officials, people like Lukash, for instance, or others, So there is an overall, I think, climate of putting pressure on executive, especially on reformers, on those who are, you kind of have to buy your way out, you have to make deals. I actually had to make deals with the guys who would make my deal, my life very difficult. I've been neutral with many of them. I didn't fight all battles, but it's clear that you need to negotiate with people who have media resources, with people who can file criminal complaints against you, and so on and so forth. And often it's not oligarchs. It might be pro-Russian forces. It might be the pro-Russian TV channels. So I think that is there, but that's not the only thing. Often it's deep bureaucracy. Those medium-level bureaucrats who have been in the ministries for decades. You come in and you try to remove them, and of course they fight back. They are fighting for their lives because you get them out of their positions. You're going to investigate them. They will be under prosecution. So I think people like Nefedov, on top of the big picture, the big political picture, they are suffering from all this backlash from all the guys on whose toes they have stepped, trying to remove them. So those guys are pushing back against Rябошапka, against Nefedov, against people who I hired too, that they're not as high profile, but my state secretary, some other people who I've hired. These guys have been under pressure from law enforcement because the previous guys holding their positions want them out. If you put enough pressure, if you make the person toxic, he gets removed, and then the position is open, and you can come back. So I think there is a lot of deep state kind of atmosphere, which makes it toxic for reformers.
Tymofiy, let me ask you a follow-up question. We talked to Max Nefedov lately, and he said that he was spending almost all of his public salary defending himself. And he said, what kind of sane person would want to go into government service? Someone with good values, who has Western training, can make 10 times more in the private sector. You've done it before. Would you go back into government again, knowing what you know now?
No.
And how can you incentivize good people like you to go in?
I wouldn't go the second time, but I would have gone, had I known what would happen, I would have gone in September anyway, in August. for very pragmatic reasons. I have learned how the system operates from inside, and this is fascinating in so many ways. It's very different from the West, and it's very different from Russia. It's very different from what we think from outside. Often black is white and white is black. I have evaluated a lot of reformers, even some of the names you had just mentioned, as beacons of reforms. I don't think so. And the other way around. Some people who have been affiliated, in public eye with Yanukovych or someone else, those guys have been actually true civil servants, in the proper, the highest sense of that. So it's, the reality, it's Alice in the Wonderland or something like that. It's really not what it seems, not what it appears. But you're right about this very specific things such as salaries. Salaries, for instance, I had a person, Sergei Nikolaychuk. He was head of the monetary policy department in the NBU, the National Bank of Ukraine. And he was the person who was in charge of macroeconomic forecasting in my ministry, preparing scenarios with and without IMF, plan B, plan C, plan D, all the contingency planning. You really want to have professionals there. There are probably 5, maybe 10 people in the country who can do that. His salary, I really had to beg him to come in the government for the salary of 6 or 7K, because his market salary is probably double of that in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And after 3 or 4 months, his salary was cut down to, I don't know, a couple of thousand or $3,000. At which time, moment he said, "Thank you very much, guys, I'm quitting." And he would have quit whether I stayed or not. And I wouldn't have a person who I can trust in terms of competence when it comes to macroeconomic forecast. And the Ukrainian budget is built on the macroeconomic forecast. So, this pressure on removing salaries is actually damaging the Ukrainian state capacity in a very direct way. Now, where this pressure is coming, I was surprised, even very pro-reform outlets such as Novoye Vremya, with these guys I'm good friends. I publish their regular op-eds, bi-weekly. I love them, they're great, as many other outlets. Even they harassed us and brought to the spotlight that Sergei Nikolaychuk's salary is several $1,000s and it's way above the minimum wage. So they somehow become victims of this play, the attention game, where you move attention and you blow things out of proportion. Of course, this might be problematic that the average salary is very low. But why are we not talking about massive corruption in the state-owned enterprises? Yes, our supervisory boards are not perfect. And, Naftogaz and Privatbank may be okay, but maybe some other state-owned enterprises not so okay. Okay, accepted. But we know that performance of all 10 or 9 enterprises which have installed supervisory board has improved. The rate of return on assets of SOEs has increased double. It doubled. Why are we not talking about it? Why even pro-reformist media outlets are not talking about it? So, it's very easy to manipulate the agenda in Ukraine because the media is so weak. The political landscape, exactly for the reasons Adrian said, there's no ideology. I wasn't even mentioning it in my criticism of what goes wrong, because we are such a long way in Ukraine from ideology. Look at Samopomich, self-help party. Look at Golos. Look at the Servant of the People. It's always a mixed bag of guys from, extremely protectionist to as liberal as it gets. Even the better parties cannot get the ideology, any ideology. So I think that's a real problem too in Ukraine. And we're a long way from having any consistent ideological parties. So I think all these things are there, but it's kind of, I will say, if you don't have cases, criminal investigations against you, you haven't done anything of value for the country.
Tymofiy, we're going to count on you to write a paper, even if it's private, explaining how the system actually works now, because I think that would be absolutely fascinating. I want to turn to Dr. Anders Åslund to bring us home, and then we're going to bring questions in from our audience. Anders, the IMF has said that it's going to pursue an 18-month agreement, $5 billion with Kiev because of unprecedented political uncertainty. Everyone had thought it was going to be a 3-year agreement and a much larger figure. Is that the right decision? What does it mean for Ukraine's finances? And will Ukraine have enough to cover its debts this year?
First of all, it's as much financing as the 3-year extended fund facility would have been for this period. It's 1.5 years, and it will be $5 billion. It will be 2 tranches of a total of $3.5 billion this year. On top of this, Ukraine will get $2 billion from the European Union and $1 billion from the World Bank. So this secures Ukraine's macroeconomic stability. That's what's really important. The difference between a standby and the extended fund facility is primarily that there are more conditions, structural reform conditions in an EFF program. So from that point of view, it would be better. The IMF now is anxious to get as much money as possible out of the door. The IMF has concluded more than 40 programs since March. So the idea is now get it out. We can't bother too much about conditionality now, and we don't know what will happen even in the very short term. So then we can't do any medium-term program. So I think that one should take this basically positively. Now we do expect that the agreement will be concluded any day, and that then it takes 2 weeks for the IMF executive board to decide on the program, and the next day the money goes out. The IMF is very fast, and the budget would then go to the budget. So this will be highly stabilizing, and I think that the IMF is behaving very properly. But as has been pointed out, the 2 important prior actions, the land market reform and the bank law, are not undertaken by the government because they really believe in it. They are undertaken because the IMF is demanding it.
Thank you. Thanks, Anders. Sandy Vershval wants to know, has Kolomoisky given up on the banking bill? Anders, do you want to take that, or Tymofiy?
Tymofiy, was this a new attempt to have a blocking law of a bank law? Is that going anywhere? Otherwise, my understanding is that it's just up to President Zelenskyy to sign the bank law now, which he obviously will do.
I think the law will be signed. The government has done, and the administration of the president, the government and the parliament has done a fantastic job in terms of changing the rules of the parliament, by the way, to prevent this technical spam with thousands of amendments which are not substantial. Interestingly, this is an innovation in the parliamentary games in Ukraine that has not happened under any previous president. We didn't have thousands of amendments, even though the rules of the parliament have not changed until recently. So, but that's just a kind of curiosity remark. I think what is the likely outcome and what is the likely risk is that the law will be contested in the constitutional court by maybe members of the parliament related to Kolomoisky or just even independent, and it will be struck down with high probability, at least non-zero probability. You might remember a similar case with the law on illegal enrichment. There are different opinions, and I have actually heard very well qualified lawyers saying that the Constitutional Court will have good grounds for striking down this law. And that probably will happen, if it is to happen, after the first tranche of the IMF. And so I think that we will see intense negotiations on the next tranche, even before the program will be over. I mean, this short 18 months program.
Thanks so much. So, gentlemen, another question for you. If you had to give Zelensky's domestic reforms an A, B, C, D, F grade, remember, this is a government that pledged to bring in $50 billion in FDI and increase the GDP by 40% over 5 years. What grade would you give them? Adrian, I'll start with you, and make these short, succinct answers, please.
I would say incomplete. I know that's not one of the.
Oh, that's a cop-out, Adrian.
No, it's incomplete because no term paper has been delivered, and Andrus is correct in saying that the program of the Cabinet of Ministers is the term paper for assessing reforms. So I will be very academically didactic in answering that.
Timothy?
Well, I'm gonna give my government A and the next government F. That's,
oh, come on.
but, let me just be a bit more serious on this and say 40% economic growth in 5 years was promised by Honcharuk, not by Zelenskyy. $50 billion investment was also promised by Honcharuk, not by Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy did promise a lot of things, including the land market and impeachment law and all kinds of other structural reforms. And by the way, land market, labor market reform as well. So those things have to be seen if some of them will be met. The progress is mixed. If we estimate it dynamically, we have seen really excellent performance in the first 3 months, as we have discussed, fantastic performance. I think many previous administrations would have been happy to get half of that, and many of the IMF teams would sign off on a new program on a number of laws which were passed without any discussion, in September and October. But I think something went wrong in the end of the year and the beginning of the next year. And now we see some rebounds and coming back with Saakashvili, with banking law being passed, with the land market law being finally passed, albeit in a very abridged version. But there is enough time to fix that as well. So, the trend is currently very mixed, but much better in my view than it was a couple of months ago. I think the low point was around these audio tapes of Honcharuk, basically Parliament not passing anything and the government being dismissed and a bunch of new ministers being dismissed immediately. That was a total, mess. So I think it's better than in February or March. But it's definitely much worse than in September. So September, October, I would put A. Right now, I'll be diplomatic on the new prime minister. He needs a bit more time to figure out his standing. It's not an easy job. He has only been in for 2 months. So, it's a bit unfair to judge him yet.
Adrian, there's a question about, could you please assess the new Prosecutor General Venediktova as a reformer after Rябошапka's removal? What are your thoughts on Venediktova?
I think she is, made pretty clear that she is close and loyal to the president and the president's interests. I think it is a highly politicized appointment. I think it is done to fulfill some of the campaign promises of, quote, putting them in jail. But I think some of the worrying things are her own private philosophy, and that is her belief that, there is no difference in the Maidan and the prosecutors of the Maidan, that everyone is equal under the law. Everyone is equal under the law, but the context in which people behave is very different. And that's a very troubling thing. She seems to be a post-communist, a post-Maidan moral equivalence prosecutor general, and we will see how she performs. But she is pulling back on some of the things that Rябошапka tried to do. Again, she hasn't had sufficient time for us to be able to make assessments, but her appointment of, for example, Yanukovych's lawyer to the deputy head of the National Bureau of Investigation was a troubling indicator of her kind of moral blinders in her previous job.
Thank you. Andrus, you get the last comment.
Thank you. I would give a government a B. And I think that what we have not mentioned, what the current government does very well, it's the COVID crisis management. And that is run by Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal. Here we had a completely new government that came in March, and it has really been focused on the coronavirus crisis and not on reform. But it has done that very well. So what they have done is that they have closed down Ukraine. They knew that the healthcare system is very weak. Therefore, they keep the infection out. and by and large, they have managed to do so. And therefore, Ukraine looks pretty healthy and clear, and now the government can gradually ease the very strict quarantine that has been in place since the 12th of March. Well, Russia, for example, started only on the 29th of March.
Thank you. Thank you all so very much for your questions. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, Tymofiy. Thank you, Adrian. And please tune in next week for another event on Ukraine's reforms. We'll be looking at UOP with Iris Abramovicus. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much. Until next time.
Thank you.